Okay, why don't we get going here? Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar examining GIS data standards related to the transition to next generation 911. Before we get going, a quick bit of housekeeping. This is a 90-minute webinar. There will be approximately 60 to 70 minutes spent on presentations. The presentation portion will be recorded. Following that, we will have Q&A. This webinar is intended for UBCM members. So when we get to the Q&A, they will have the first opportunity to ask questions. Once they've had a chance, time permitting, we'll open up the Q&A to the rest of the attendees. So it is very important to identify yourself when you are trying to ask a question. We have some great presentations lined up today from Esri Canada. Our presenters today are Robert Harris and Sharon Cook. Robert is the Next Generation 911 Data and Solutions Manager at Esri Canada. He is helping to develop standards and best practices as it relates to GIS for NG 911 for Canada. He is the co-chair of the Emergency Services Working Group, TIF 92, which will be laying the foundation for GIS NG 911 for network service providers, aggregators, and local data authorities across the country. Robert has over a decade of experience in the GIS and public safety industries. Our second presenter is Sharon Cook. Sharon Cook is a senior consultant at Esri Canada, specializing in next generation 911 and public safety project implementations. Previously, she worked for a large 911 public safety answering point in many roles, including call taker, dispatcher, supervisor, subject matter expert, and business analyst. She is an active participant in the CRTC's Emergency Services Working Group and is the co-chair of TIF 94, which deals with helping places with basic 911 today transition to NG 911. She also contributes to the National Emergency Number Association standards writing, in addition to working on industry discussions, reporting, and documentation. She has a master's degree in professional communication and has her emergency number professional designation through NENA. Welcome, Sharon and Robert, and over to you.
Thank you so much. So we have a bit of an agenda for you today. We're going to first go into how 911 works today. Why does it matter? Why are we making these changes and asking so much of everyone in terms of NG 911? Specifically looking at the GIS requirements. We're going to talk a little bit about a project that we dealt with Guelph through the DRDC. And then we'll talk about transforming data, some of the best practices, and then what comes next. To start with, there's a couple of different sites out there that we just want to point you towards. The first one being the NENA Knowledge Base Glossary. This industry is full of all kinds of acronyms, and right out of the gate, we can get so good at using all these acronyms, not always remembering. There's people that might not know what some of them are. So if you're ever wondering what a particular acronym or term or thing means, you can always go to the NENA Knowledge Base Glossary and know that this is a authoritative source for those definitions, and they should help point you in the right direction. If there's anything you're not sure of when it comes to GIS related matters, Esri has a GIS dictionary, which again GIS has its own set of acronyms that come into all of this. So both of those sources are places you can go to help give you some of that background.
All right, so before we get too far into it, Sharon and I wanted to kind of make sure everybody was up to the same speed on kind of how the system is built and works today. So in today's Enhanced 911 call process, which is a process really built for landline phones. We have our landline phones that have a known phone number and a known location. It's stuck to the wall and doesn't really move, and we know the address of that house and the phone number of that landline. When that landline calls 911, it goes to whatever the phone company is that's providing that service. They do a lookup on the phone number and determine who the 911 service provider is. They transfer that call to the 911 service provider, who then does a bit of a lookup into their databases to figure out, it does a lookup into something called the Master Street Address Guide, MSAG, to determine who the emergency service provider should be. It creates something, it looks up the ANI, which is the phone number, and goes through a piece of technology called the selective router, which really is the brains of the routing, and says, hey, for this number on this road, we need to go to this 911 public safety answering point, or PSAP. And from that PSAP, we can dispatch police, fire, ambulance, whatever may be needed. The system was built in the 90s on analog copper wire technology, and we've tried to do some improvements over the years to incorporate things like wireless, cell phone calls. But the routing is essentially it's very similar for wireless as it is for the landline calls. So instead of having a landline phone, we have our mobile phone. The routing for that phone, though, goes to whatever cell phone tower provides the strongest signal to that phone. Not necessarily the closest, but whichever it can get the strongest signal from. From that tower, it goes to a mobile switching center, which says, hey, I know where this tower is. I'm going to create a pseudo ANI from it, send that to the 911 service provider who's going to route the call. While that routing is happening, your cell phone does some fancy black magic in the background and triangulation with other nearby cell towers to try to figure out a relative XY coordinate of the location of that cell phone, and we'll send that to the PSAP with a bit of a circle of uncertainty to say, hey, we think this cell phone, we know we routed it based on the tower, but based on all the other towers near it, we also think it might be here in this location. And really where we are now is we're at a bit of a dawn. We call it, Sharon and I like to call it the dawn of a new era. So we have our old legacy technology. It's worked for us since about the 90s, but it really can't keep up. You know, we have this system that was built for landline phones with fixed locations, but what the reality of today is 80% or more, depending on your area, of 911 calls today are coming from mobile devices. And we have a variety of other things that are trying to interact with the 911 system, whether they are voice over IP calls, people on their mobile phones trying to text from multi-line telephone systems, Internet of Things devices, alarms, etc., that all would love to interact with the 911 system today, but the system really was not built for them. And NextGen kind of helps open the door to these kinds of things.
So let's talk a little bit about why we need to make these changes and what really matters at the end of the day. So the fact of the matter is a lot of people don't have landlines in their homes anymore. And this is important because when you think that the whole system was built around those landlines, being able to route the calls effectively, we need to do something that's going to work better for that. And you can think of this too, is if you have a babysitter that comes to your home, if you don't have a landline in your house, does that babysitter have a way to reach out and get help? And if that babysitter has a cell phone, which probably they do they know the address of the house that you're at? And do you have that posted somewhere that if an emergency happens, it's easy to find? Because more and more places are dropping their landlines. And when that happens, it does come with a bit of a risk of knowing the address when an emergency does happen. There's lots of agencies out there that still rely on paper maps, in part because their data is so out of date. We've come across agencies where the data is 2, 3, even 5 or 7 years old at times. And it's really not ideal. And it kind of speaks to some of the issues that are involved with the proprietary natures of some of the programs that are out there today. So you can think of growth in some areas of the country. An entirely new neighborhood gets built. Imagine you move into this new home 2 years ago. You've built your yard, your basement is developed. Now you're having a child, and suddenly that child is 2 years old and that child trips and falls. And they've hit their they've hit their head and they've lost consciousness. The panicked parent calls 911 only to have the call takers struggle to put that address in because that address hadn't been yet updated. And so it really speaks to the importance of getting data that's current into the systems. Paper maps do have their place and they can be good backup plans, but more and more, there's a lot of different technologies out there that even within like a tablet or something like that, you can use mapping and add things like hazardous goods and things that a fire commander might want to have when they're dispatching an event. But the bottom line is paper maps, although they do have their place, they really don't cut it in the way that technologies work anymore. A challenge faced by emergency responders all the time happens around when proposed roads and addresses are added to authoritative data sets. And this problem further is exacerbated by the currency of the data that's used in those 911 systems. It can make a huge difference in terms of response if an accident happens, and they do. Say, for example, at a construction site, The timing of when that business need is at the municipality to add the addresses versus when a first responder might want that information is different. If this was your son that was at a house that's under construction and falls, and that address isn't in there to give to responders, it can be really tricky to try and figure out how to get help as quickly as possible to that very time sensitive emergency. We don't just use phones anymore for voice calls. We use them for texting, we use them for FaceTime, we use them for a lot of different ways, but the way the current system is designed, we can't actually even text 911 today. So with NG 911, we bring in the ability to start adding these different modalities of reaching a 911 center, including things like text. So we'll get into that a little bit more in the future, but the idea being that you might be in an emergency and maybe it's not safe to call, but perhaps you could send a text. So the idea of being able to use different ways of communicating to 911 becomes important. Private roads and addresses can be any number of things. It can be campuses, business parks, condominium complexes, hospitals, airports, schools. There's all kinds of examples, including something like this trailer park here. And oftentimes what happens though is when it's these big complexes, only the street address of the parcel is mapped, which is fine because typically whoever is doing that doesn't need to do the garbage removal or the street clearing and stuff like that. But the fact of the matter is when emergency responders want to go out to a site like this, it can be very difficult to find an exact unit. I actually went out and took pictures at a mobile park that I knew wasn't addressed properly for the CAD system that was in my community. And basically, it's the kind of thing where these maps sort of appear and you can see them at the start of any trailer park. That's great, right? You can just pull up to the map and hope that it's not too sun-stained that you can actually read it still. And then you can start looking up and trying to figure out which exact unit am I headed for? Because it starts out nice and normal here. You've got 2, 4, 6, 8. It goes up, it goes into the 100s, it goes into the 200s. And then suddenly it's at 900. And then it starts going down to the 800s and the 700s. And then some of these other areas in here are like the 600s and the 500s. But you can also see some of these have little cul-de-sacs and some of them have little street throughways. But then you can also see the types of signs that they have in there are not the kind of thing that's going to be really reflective or easy to see at night if you're there at 2 in the morning trying to respond to someone who's doing CPR on someone who's collapsed. So the bottom line is, in a lot of cases, emergency responders would really like to have the information that can be found in these complexes, but many times they don't, and it really does slow down response when this happens. Roadways are busy and sometimes coverage can be quite questionable. We live in the second largest country in the world, but covering that entire country is not an easy one. Incidents can happen along these roadways and we want to know that the calls route to the appropriate place. And in some cases, there's not even always cell service depending on the highway and things like that as well. So being able to reach out, it's important to know what can and cannot be done. For a myriad of reasons, there's places in Canada that cannot reach 911 directly and have to access emergency services via alternate measures. In some cases, it's dialing a 10-digit number. In other cases, there's places that have basic 911, but you don't get any location information or anything like that. But in either way, we talk about 911 as being something that's available to everyone to reach out to help. And the idea that there's parts of our country that you can't do that, well, we'd really like to think that in the future, everybody would have access to 911. You may have heard the story of Carey's Law, and if not, I'm just going to share it now quickly. This is something that happened in the United States, but it speaks to multi-line telephone systems and some of the challenges that exist at the 911 centers because of them. So basically, Carrie Hunt was someone that was trying to separate from her husband, and she had made arrangements for him to see the kids, and so they went to a hotel room. And at one point, her and her husband went into the bathroom to have a discussion. And at that point, he gets upset and begins attacking her. And the kids are in the room and they can hear this happening. And so the one daughter, who's 9 at the time, picks up the phone and tries to dial 911. She tried 4 different times, but the call didn't go through. And part of the reason was because of this multi-line telephone system, she needed to dial 9 first to get an outside line and then dial 911. So after the death of her mom, Carrie's dad actually spent the next several years working to make sure that any place that has a telephone system like this no matter what, you could just dial 911. You didn't need to dial any kind of prefix first. And so there's a US law now called Kerry's Law that speaks to this. But it also, in addition to that, requires that notification be made to staff at the business site as well. This is, again, through the United States, but the CRTC in Canada looks to this to see what they can do. And earlier this summer, there was actually a notice of consultation that was out on trying to come up with some of the best practices that we need in Canada when it comes to multi-line telephone systems. And taking it one step further, dispatchable location is another piece that's really important. Anyone who's worked in a 911 center can tell you it can be very frustrating when you get a call from a hospital, a hotel, whatever it is, and all you know is that it's at this address. You don't know what room called or what area that the call came from. And so again, in the United States, it's Raybaum's Act that talks about this, but in Canada, we'll be using guidance from what we see down there to come up with what's going to work best in Canada. But the idea here being that when you place a call from a hotel or any of these places, that we not only find out what the actual parcel is, but where's the endpoint that made that call so that we can get help there sooner when it is needed. And I don't know if you've heard of Flat Stanley or not, but he's a character from a book series that was created by Jeff Brown. And basically, he's a young boy, and in the book series, a bulletin board falls on him, and he becomes as flat as a pancake. And so this is kind of cool because he can slide under doors, and you can stick him in the mail and send him off to visit friends overseas, things like that. Basically, though, he's a 2D character that's living in a 3D world. And this is much like most of the maps that are used in a PSAP. They're 2D maps, and that's not exactly the world we live in. Emergencies can happen in 3D. They can happen on the highest floor of a high rise or a hotel. And if all we get is an XY coordinate, then how are we going to find that particular patient in a large building if they haven't been able to provide more of an address to us? So in the US, they're already starting to deliver the Z axis or that height requirement. And eventually that'll be coming to Canada as well. But in order to make use of that information, you're going to need some kind of 3D or indoor map or something to help give us a better idea of where exactly that responder might want to be responding to. Because if suddenly somebody's having a mayday or anything like that, and you're trying to get in as quickly as you can to the emergency, it's a lot better to know we're responding to the 14th floor than starting on the ground level and then just hoping that we get to the floor right out of the gate. And then technologies. The old system just isn't keeping up anymore. Robert already made mention of that. There's new ways to be able to reach out. And unfortunately, technology doesn't always keep us as on the cutting edge of locations as we might want to be. Because, for example, you could go to a restaurant, and I'm sure you've popped an address into whatever navigation system you have in your phone and driven to the address and then just gone inside and began your meal. But what if suddenly somebody is choking at the table and you have to call 911? This was actually an occurrence at one point, and the caller who dialed 911 didn't know what the address was. So she started coming up or trying to figure out what street they were on, and she made up an address, and the call taker went with it. But unfortunately, it wasn't the right address, and the ambulance drove right past the restaurant. Eventually, they figured it out and managed to get the ambulance back to where they needed to be. But unfortunately, in this case, the patient didn't make it. And without a doubt, having the right location out of the gate would have made a difference because of the time. Would it have changed the outcome? We don't know for sure, but we do know that it's an important, it would have given them a better chance had we had that better address right out of the gate. So this is where NG 911 comes along. And sometimes when you look at something like NG, it can seem like it's so many big things. So there's different ways to compare it. And a new comparison that I've come up with is kind of looking at like the building of a cruise ship. So at the very beginning, when a cruise ship is first built, they lay the keel, and this could be kind of compared to when we put the EZInet in place. And then they begin to build all the different pieces and segments of the ship. So this can be the individual cabins. Sometimes things are built off-site and then transported and slotted into the ship. And so this could be similar to how the different PSAPs out there are procuring their call handling equipment and figuring out what kind of things need to be upgraded for these new changes. And then eventually a ship will become to a point where it's seaworthy and we can put it out in the water and start doing tests that way. Much like with NG911, we began with voice trials. Eventually we get to a point where we're happy and we turn the ship over to the cruise line to do the next set of things that they need to do. And again, if you're looking at NG, this could be the work that happens when we put the EZNet into production. This could be all of these different pieces all the way through until we start being at the point where we can bring passengers on board, which would be kind of when we'd be decommissioning the old system. But even at the point when passengers come on board, we still continue to have to do lots of things to keep this ship up and running. And much like NG911, that'll be when we start integrating things like real-time text, and then eventually this GIS piece and being able to route calls geodetically that we're talking about here today. So
when we look at the big picture for next gen and who's really involved, there, as you can imagine, there are a lot of partners and a lot of participants. At the top, we have kind of the steering light, and that is the CRTC. So they are the regulatory body for all of the telephone companies in Canada, and they are the ones that make the decisions and set the edicts for how 911 is going to roll out across the country. So they make decisions. They make all of those decisions for the telephone companies for how the system is going to roll out. But they can't do all of their work in a bubble. The CRTC has a number of steering committees and working groups that help kind of guide its work. One of those is, we've already mentioned here today, is ESWIG, the Emergency Services Working Group. And we're going to hear from the ESWIG chair in just a few minutes. And really at ESWIG, the way I like to think about it is at ESWIG, we have a large group of participants from the entire industry. And whenever we have nice actionable pieces of work, we wrap those together in something called a task identification form, or TIF. We number that TIF, it gets reported on to the CRTC, and inside all of those TIFs, we have kind of defined goals and metrics. So one of those TIFs is the one I co-chair, TIF 92, which is really setting out that GIS foundation and data model for what we're going to use here in Canada. The next kind of big governing body is NENA, the National Emergency Number Association. So they are the organization that writes all of the actual standards documents that we're using here in Canada. If any of these groups kind of sound interesting to you, please feel free to reach out to Sharon and I afterwards, and we can link you up to whichever one kind of kind of strikes your interest. But these are kind of the three governing bodies for Next Gen 911 and 911 here in Canada. So, timeline. This is an important slide, and we'll take a minute to go through with everyone. But there's a couple kind of key things that are happening on our timeline. So these timelines are decided by the CRTC. So they make a decision and they say, we shall do this by then. So as part of their decisions, our voice network EZNet went live March 1st, 2022. So as Sharon said, we stood up that ship. And we were able to transmit voice calls over that network. Once we had that EZNet built, we could then start onboarding some of our PSAPs. Our first PSAP went live on that EZNet just a couple of weeks ago at the end of October. Strathcona County in Alberta gets to wave the flag and wear the badge as being the first across the finish line. And as you can see, we still have quite a ways to go on our timeline. So the next kind of big dates are March 4th, 2025, and there are two big things expected to happen then. One, as per the CRTC, we are going to decommission our current E911 network. So by then, we should all be onboarded onto the EZNet. And it is also the timeline we're looking to roll out something called real-time text. So that will enable us to start interacting with 911 via text messaging. So along the bottom of the graph, we have a couple of other things to bring your point to, or to bring your attention to. And this is this geodetic call routing that we've started hinting at earlier in the presentation. And really that is locating callers using GIS. So today, as we said early in the presentation, we are routing calls based on an MSAG, a Master Street Address Guide. And in the future, we're going to be using GIS to do that. We're looking to start transitioning to geodetic call routing in early 2025. So those jurisdictions that are ready to go have their GIS data up to snuff, up to public safety grade, as we like to call it. Letting them go first, find out where any bugs or kinks may be, with the entire country in production by May 2027.
Some of the different TIFs, and just wanted to point out that there's actually quite a few different TIFs that speak to GIS and location related items. So depending on your interest, you can always reach out to us and learn a little bit more.
So when it comes to NG911, we've put this summary slide together of kind of where we are today in the E or Enhanced 911 world and where we're going in Next Gen 911. And we've really highlighted the bottom 3 buckets there. So these are kind of the categories that are most likely to impact you as GIS data providers, or you as an organization that is getting things ready for Next Gen 911. Moving from that landline civic address to X, Y, and Z coordinates, moving away from MSAG lookup tables to geodetic call routing, and really adopting one standard for the entire country. So we've talked about the existing E911 call flow, both for landline and for wireless. So we wanted to kind of conceptually show you a little bit of how calls are going to work in Next Gen 911. So we have our EZNet. That is our IP network of networks that exists at the telephone company. So for those of us in BC, that'll be TELUS. We have being fed into that EZNet all of our good public safety grade GIS data from a variety of organizations. It gets fed into one side of the EZNet. Feeding into the other side of the EZNet are all of the different ways that we can interact with Next Gen 911. So whether it's wireline, so that's our landline phones, wireless, that's our cell phones, voice over IP, enterprise systems like our MLTS systems that Sharon was talking about earlier, they will have incoming calls into NG911. But before they can get into this IP network, as you can imagine, we want to make sure that it's not some sort of rogue actor trying to come into the network. So we have a functional element called the border control function. The EZNet is made up of a number of functional elements. I call them the bits and bobs of the EZNet. So calls go through the border control function. They say, yep, this is a valid 911 call. And it goes to a different functional element called the ESRP, the Emergency Services Routing Proxy. And that ESRP is going to go look up all of that GIS data and say, hey, I know where this call is, and I know from this GIS data which PSAP needs to get this call. I've looked it up in the emergency call routing function. I know where this has to go. It's going to go back out through a different border control function, right to that I3 PSAP. And I3 is basically just the NENA standard for Next Gen 911 PSAPs. As you can imagine, this is if a PSAP is fully onboarded into the EZNet. This isn't quite where we are today. We still have most of our PSAPs in Canada are still on the legacy network, and we're not doing geodetic call routing quite yet. So they have to go through a number of legacy gateways. So these gateways exist, and as you can see, the legacy E911 calls, the legacy selective router that we talked about earlier for the black magic that routes the call, they will interact with the EZNet in through a legacy gateway, out through a legacy gateway to a legacy PSAP. And eventually, once we have onboarded all of our PSAPs to Next Gen and are using GIS to route the calls, we will no longer need these legacy gateways. So we'll throw up this slide, and I'll send a small word of caution. Next Gen 911 is a big enabler. It can enable, it can unlock, open the door for a whole lot of new things when it comes to Next Gen 911. the ability to send pictures, videos, streaming videos, information from crash detection in your car or your Apple Watch or whatever. All of these things become enabled in NextGen 911. Will we be there the first day we roll out this system? Absolutely not. But these are the kinds of things and some of the reasons why we are starting to move down this winding road to NextGen 911. Especially when it comes to things like indoors and 3D. Sharon touched upon this earlier. If you get a call at a school or an office building, being able to narrow right down to a classroom or even a seat, which is possible in NextGen 911, really kind of transforms the way we're responding to emergencies today.
So what exactly is GIS? GIS is a geographic information system, also known as location intelligence. And basically what you're doing is you're taking all of the different layers and putting them on top of one another to give you better information about how a particular piece of geography and what is related to that space. Moving on to how is the point and polygon piece going to work in the future? GIS becomes critical in order to be able to route calls, and we'll go into that a little bit in another slide. But basically, in order to get to the point where we can use calls, we have to figure out how we're going to do that. To do that, that's where those standards come in. So things like the NINA data model that we've already alluded to, and there's another one, a couple of other standards and documents that can help with getting that data ready. But the bottom line is, in order for TELUS to be able to route these calls, we have to have a complete map for their entire coverage area and arguably for the whole country. And in order to do that, we need to have a common delivery schema, which is where that GIS data model comes in.
So when it comes to standards, there's two that we want to really bring to your attention. One is that NINA standard for NextGen 911 GIS data model. So version 2A of this document was recently released, and there are a number of us who are currently now working on the version 3 of that data model. This is expected to be the data model adopted by the CRTC for NextGen 911 in Canada. We should have a decision from them within the next couple of months, formalizing that. And the other one is another document called the Civic Location Data Exchange Format for Canada, CLDXF-CA. And basically that document will define all of those bits and bobs in the EZNet, all of those functional elements of the EZNet that need to pass location information back and forth with each other. The CLDXF-CA document kind of outlines how that data will be structured to be passed back and forth. Inside the NINA standard for GIS data model, they have a number of GIS layers, and they've categorized them as required, strongly recommended, and recommended. And really the way that this works is required is just that. These are required to do that geodetic call routing. So these are a must. Thankfully, they're things that a lot of organizations already have. They may need to change a little bit of the schema on when they're exporting the data to get it ready for NextGen 911, but these are core needs. So we have our road center lines, our site structure address points, so the civic addresses, our primary PSAP boundaries, so the extent of the area getting that call, some service boundaries, police, fire, EMS, and a new thing called the provisioning boundary. So for those that aren't familiar with what provisioning boundary is, basically it's a polygon that says I'm responsible for all of the data inside this polygon. No one else can submit inside it, and if there's ever any issues with this data, send it back to me. That's what its purpose is. For the strongly recommended and recommended layers, the strongly recommended have other usefulness inside of the EZNet and can be helpful to the ECRF when it's routing calls. And for the recommended layers, really those are just about setting up a really nice and complete map for situational awareness.
terms of exactly how this point and polygon works, I do not come from a GIS background, so I like to have a visual and try and understand it in a way that makes sense to me. So basically, if you imagine that we have somewhere a house fire has happened, and this particular address calls 911. So either the fixed address that's part of the like their civic address, the site structure address point, or the road center line, that address can already be known, or the phone coordinates, if it was coming in on a mobile phone, that information is going to be here now, and we're going to start to look and try and figure out where does this call belong. So the first thing it's going to look for is which is the PSAP, and so basically it's going to try and grab a PSAP boundary. So we want that boundary to be complete so that we know that it's going to figure out where to send that call. But then it's also going to want to package up a little bit more information in terms of, okay, well, if it's a medical call, where does it need to go? What if it's a police call? Where does it need to go? Well, what if it's a fire call? And basically all that information is going to be packaged up together and then sent off to the primary, the PSAP that's answering the call in the form of what we call it today is an Annie Alley. Exactly what we're going to call it tomorrow still remains to be seen. But the bottom line is the information is going to be packaged and sent in a way that whoever answers that call can either help that citizen or downstream that call to exactly where it needs to go, depending on the kind of emergency that is in play. So the work that we did with Guelph was very much around helping Guelph as a authoritative data provider get their data ready for NG 911. We wanted to have minimal impact to the operations that they do today. It needed to be something that is repeatable, and it needed to be something that could help improve response time. So the ultimate objective, again, is supporting PSAPs in their ability to deliver improved and modernized 911 services to Canadians. And this was a research project that looked at the data that was underlying the NG 911 process, with, again, the aim to develop and demonstrate GIS technology, tools, data provisioning, GIS formats, workflows, best practices, and the idea, again, being that what happens in Guelph should be generic in nature so that similar data management approaches could be implemented in municipalities across the country. Some of the main delivery objectives on a more granular level, transforming and populating their existing data into that NG 911 geodatabase, building and implementing QA and QC tools to ensure that the data meets the NG 911 requirements, building and implementing things like dashboards to help as the data was being adjusted and modified to meet that delivery schema, build creation, sharing, and update tools with the hope that some of those update tools will help reach that aspirational goal of being able to update an error or an issue within 72 hours, successfully trial and test the system to meet Guelph's NG 911 requirements, and then provide stakeholder engagement and opportunities to share this information and have presentations about what we learned. So where the project currently is, we're in the very final stages of this. We're in the documentation stage, building out user guides, reports, best practices, and then figuring out the phase 2 side of this. So a lot of different people have gone into getting this project off the ground. We documented everything through Azure DevOps. So any of the work package items and work items that had to be created were created here and could be assigned and go from there. Now, when you look at the typical sort of data flow that happens, Esri has a free tool that was given to, or that was created for the Emergency Services Working Group. So basically anyone can go online and check their data to see where it fits in terms of that, what is required for NG. After this, what happens is data has to be created, fixed up and made ready and possibly transformed into what is needed for NINA. And so this is where different tools can help with that. But at the end of the day, this ETL process then goes through the QA and QC, and there's different ways to check that data. And the bottom line is, if any errors are detected, we have to go back and fix the errors and continue this cycle until such a time that there's no errors. And then at that point, that data should be ready from an NG 911 standpoint to be used in next generation 911. So there's all kinds of different validation checks that are done. And one of the really big parts of this is a gaps and overlaps piece. And you can see in this picture on the side here, if there was a house fire that was to happen in this sort of section that's green, you can see that there's a boundary that's below and a boundary that's above it. But if it happened to happen somewhere in the middle here, there would be this gap. And there is a safety net that's in place that if a call doesn't have a home, it can go to a default PSAP. But the bottom line is we want to kind of try and prevent that. So one of the biggest pieces to get working on is this matching up your boundaries with your neighbors to ensure we have complete coverage without any gaps and overlaps. So some of the different tests that we did for QA/QC included checks for those gaps and overlaps. And then the data interoperability ETL is what we use to take the raw data from Guelph and convert it into a NINA GIS data model. So what exactly is data interoperability? It's basically kind of like a recipe card. It's a repeatable way of telling a computer how to modify data. So we wrote this recipe basically on how to convert the data from Guelph into the schema that is needed for NG911. You can map the different input fields and the output fields, and then with additional processing in the middle and modifying is what will get you to the point that your data will need to be for NG. Along the way, we did have some dashboards that helped to give a visual on how the errors were going. So in the beginning, we had errors in the thousands. And as we sort of worked on that ETL process and figuring out exactly what we needed to do, we were able to bring down the number of errors until we had a usable set of data.
So a couple of slides just to kind of highlight some of the action items that are happening in Guelph. I'm gonna change hats and put my Guelph City GIS hat on for a couple of slides. One of the first things that happened was Guelph had performed a NG911 GIS readiness assessment, and when we looked at that assessment, you know, the initial thought was, hey, this is all about the data and the data model. That's it. It's whether or not we can meet the data model. And we quickly realized that much like an iceberg, you know, the data model and data was simply just the tip of that iceberg and what we see above the water. What really came out of this assessment was the need to look at some information management. So what are our procedures, our SOPs, our responsibilities? You know, are we set up to make sure that this information can flow? And then really the organizational understanding piece of, okay, who owns what's documented? Do we need agreements with our neighbors? And really looking at that collaboration to make sure that everyone's kind of singing from the same songbook for everything Next Gen 911. As well, we did a comparison between Guelph's data and data from StatsCan. So the federal government has a database at StatsCan of address data. And basically, if you have interacted with the federal government in 2 or more ways and have provided your address to 2 or more different agencies, the feds have kept that address and have used it in part of their database. So what we found was there was about 150 single address points missing and about 10,000 sub addresses missing. So these could be things like individual condos, apartment units, or what was evidently the case of granny suites. So someone has a basement apartment. Perhaps the city was never notified of this basement apartment, but they've claimed EI or a tax refund or something like that. So suddenly this database exists in the federal government. And basically sending someone out to go and see if this address exists. So, you know, whether or not, you know, we're going to start doing some taxation things with these addresses remains to be seen. But you know, in the case of an emergency, the fire truck or the ambulance really would love to know that basement apartment, that granny suite is really there. The next thing that they were doing was going and remapping their fire response zones. So this wasn't necessarily one of the project deliverables, but it was one of the outcomes that happened. So you can see on the left, the previous fire response zones, and on the right, really lining them up to the addresses that are part of that response. And they have 36 fire response zones that they were able to remap to make them more accurate to what the actual response on the ground was looking like. Another big issue was missing streets and access ways, and Sharon touched upon this earlier with our mobile home example. But in the database, we only had this Westwood Road, and all of these complexes are addressed off the road, when really all of these different units could be mapped into the database, so that when the fire truck is zooming down the road, it knows where it needs to pull in, and exactly which front door it needs to be going to. We talked about knowing your neighbor, and Guelph and the county of Wellington around it have going through this exercise. When we talk about matching your boundaries, a common thing we get a lot as well. These are our legal boundaries and et cetera, and which is great, and lawyers love that. But what we're really talking about is coming to some sort of an agreement for the purposes of 911, so that those calls can route. So that those PSAP boundaries match, and we don't get, as Sharon mentioned, that example of the house trying to call in and it's in a gap area. So anecdotally, Guelph and Wellington were able to go and meet over coffee and come up to an agreement for all of the areas along their edge where it didn't match. They expect all of those to be resolved within a year. Anecdotally, they suspect it'll take, if they do it, the current process for fixing and resolving boundary issues, 10 years. To resolve all of its other neighboring boundaries. For next gen, that's not really a suitable timeline especially for the purposes of 911 delivery. So really having those conversations now and finding a better way to kind of come to a mutual kind of agreement on some of those boundary lines is essential. So some data quality checks, things to consider. Again, this is a bit of a recap of what we've talked about. Is the data consistent? Is the data complete? Are these polygons edge matched? Are they connected to each other? Are we creating any gaps or overlaps between the data sets? Are our roads being snapped to those boundaries, and are they connecting to each other at our edges? All of these things are important data quality checks to consider when kind of getting this data ready for next gen. Guelph also did a bit of a review of their documentation. So looking at, are there additional data layers that we're going to need to include? Do we have policies and procedures to collect that data, to share that data? Do we need to create some new documentation? Do we need to create these new SOPs? That kind of thing. These are all steps that Guelph is doing today as part of this, the output of this project. And then I think we have one more.
So
One more,
sort of a summary of what they've been doing. So just as a takeaway for other municipalities, becoming familiar with those NENA standards, that's a really important one. They've also changed their philosophy when it comes to data creation to include emergency management in how things are done. So that could be anything from where a point is placed. Is it on an access? Is it on an access? Is it on the entry of a building? Is it the centroid of a parcel? But really starting to have that emergency piece in mind when creating those addresses and roads. They're doing preliminary checks using that validator just to make sure that the data that they have is matching with that. They've looked and found some of their gaps in documentation, and then they've started to take that deeper dive into some of those addresses and trying to see where those discrepancies lie and how they can address those and make sure that what data is out there and addresses are out there are also reflective of the authoritative source, and if not, understanding what to do about that. So in that, they've done some of those field inspections. They're actually going out and doing ground truthing on the addresses that they don't have in their data set. And they've also been working hard on those relationships. So with their county and neighbors and things like that, because it's those kind of places where coming to agreements on things like those gaps and overlaps is important. In terms of data quality, they're doing topological checks as well as doing edge matching on all those boundaries. They're trying to catch any of the streets that aren't in the data today that should be. And then they have timelines around when are they going to put streets. And this sort of speaks to that construction example that I provided earlier, because when you need it in the city hall might not be the same as when the first responders need it, and to just try and figure out what the best timeliness is for adding those. And then they're also looking at a lot of their processes and are they going to need extra resources to do some of this work? And then some of those changes that I already alluded to with their data creation. So a lot of it comes down to basically updating and going back and looking through some of that documentation and seeing where it needs to be updated in terms of NG 911. And the biggest takeaway really is that collaboration is key, getting to know the different parties that are all using the data to ensure the data meets the standards that are for NG, but also meets the standards of the people who are going out to these emergencies. We don't want people using third-party sources of data if the authoritative data can provide those answers. So the project found a few different things. In terms of data, one of the things we had to do on our side was to clean up the data so that we could begin injecting errors and make sure that all of the errors were caught. But some of the cleanup we did was actually the real life solutions that have to be found. So if there were duplicates, someone has to go out and figure out why is this a duplicate and fix it. We could easily add a number, but that doesn't actually fix the problem in terms of real life. One of the things with some of the boundaries too was it created micro gaps. So there has to be a certain tolerance that can be in place for that. And then updating that documentation. Esri Canada has tried to build some documentation too around best practices when it comes to community road networks, civic addressing. These have continually been evolving as the NG 911 standards are updated or changed to make sure that the information that we're providing to give some of those best practices matches with what's required for the NG world. And then finally, this last phase of the project we're in, it really is about cleaning up that documentation, creating those user guides, interviewing the different people who may touch the data or have touched the data throughout the process. Coming up with those best practices. We'll also be doing a contribution for the Emergency Services Working Group, and we provide education around some of these pieces. Because at the end of the day, it really comes down to NG is going to continue to evolve. And if we go back to that cruise ship analogy sort of one more time, every time that cruise ship pulls into a port, it's going to unload passengers and reload passengers. But as you can see, like on the right-hand side here, there's already work going on and maintenance, and you can consider those different patches that have to go in and updates, and as something new rolls out or there's changes, every one of those next steps that's going to happen with NG, it's continually going to evolve, and we just have to continually work towards it. And finally, just from the point of view of the project that we had with Guelph, this project was supported by the Canadian Safety and Security Program. It's a federal program led by Defence Research and Development Canada's Centre for Security Science in partnership with Public Safety Canada. And the project partners included the City of Guelph and Esri Canada. So it's allowed us to do sort of phase one of this project. The next phase would be to start integrating the different pieces of data within one another to start building out that map for our 911 network providers. So